As usual, another great guest, but a quick diversion. You'll notice that our full name is the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a moment. If you'd like to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and be able to see alternative doctors or go across state lines for care, then you definitely need to take a look at patientempowerment.mpb.health and see if that's the fix you've been looking for. Now, let's get back to the show.
Welcome to the Freedom Hub, the marketplace for health, wealth, and freedom. We have a great program today. But before we get into that, I just want to share our website with you, which is your-mp.com. Lots of good stuff here. We're actually in the process of renovating it now, or upgrading it, whatever you want to call it. And also, so if you go to the Home tab, you can click on Webinars, and theoretically it'll open. There it is. And we have a bunch. You'll see who's coming up, who's here now. We have webinars on the Zoom webinars podcasts on Wednesday and Thursday, some great speakers, and you can always continue the conversation afterwards. These videos are posted on several channels. They're down below on the, usually maybe 2 days afterwards. All right, so let's go back to our, stop the screen share and come back. There we go. So today our presenter is Artemiss Keyhani, and she's coming to us from Australia. And the topic is integrating our shadow for a free world. Integrated intuition with common sense strategies for life and business. Between behavioral manipulating, let me read my sheet here. Between the behavioral manipulating great reset of the elitists and the ineffable great awakening claimed by the activists lies reality and your life. How should we respond to the chaos and the opportunities? Now, before I go further and introduce her, I just wanted to say a couple of words about this past week. We've entered a new era with this Ukraine-Russia conflict. And there's a couple of things of note I just wanted to mention. One of them, I was laughing the other day. Somebody sent me an article from a mainstream newspaper. It wasn't the Post. I don't remember what it was. But it had Putin. It was saying they finally uncovered the real reason that Russia went to war, and that Putin wanted the destruction of the United States. That was the end goal. And I'm laughing because I'm thinking, seriously, I mean, Biden is destroying the United States really well, very efficiently. We certainly don't need Vladimir Putin trying his hand at that unnecessary. Sorry, I've got to let somebody in here. I'm doing this. So I had to laugh. I thought that was just crazy. And the second thing I want to point out is that there's been a lot of in the media, alternative media, which we'll be talking about, showing different clips from Ukraine, that we have bioweapons labs there that have been bombed out. I mean, bad stuff. And so, and some of the guns are fake. Some of the news stories are fake. It kind of goes back. We were duped with COVID. Maybe we're being misled again or duped with what's going on over there today. So I guess I just want to say, I caution people now, just don't take sides, just sit back and look at what's going on. And the other thing is we've been in this duality, this polarity. It's us against them. And it's time, I think, and we were talking a little about this, to change that, to go with a unity approach, a love approach, heartfelt. Everybody's, for anybody getting hurt, let's just wish for peace and that this all settles in an amicable way and we get somewhere towards a better future. Okay, I'll post something later. Let me continue now with Artemiss and tell you a little bit about her. As a clarity coach, Ms. Keyhani uses personal development and shadow work as a key tool in guiding people to become aligned within themselves, so they can live their lives and build their businesses with integrity and authenticity. because that is what the new earth requires of us. Absolutely. To be truly empowered individuals supporting conscious capitalism and creating transparent political systems, we must witness, heal, and integrate our individual and collective shadows. Artemiss has over 25 years in personal development and shadow work coaching, leadership coaching, and more. She's coming us to again from New South Wales. And for those who weren't on earlier, she's actually from Persia, Iran, into the United States. Actually, their family lived near me here in Alexandria, Virginia, and then moved to Australia. Her motto is, which I love, "You are the only guru you need." And ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sorry if that's not politically correct, I present to you Artemiss K.
Thank you so much, Jim. Yes, let's leave the political correctness out the door for now. Thank you, and good morning from my side of the world, and good afternoon to you guys. So I've just prepared a little bit of an introduction to what shadows are and what the shadow work is about. And then we can explore ideas and examples and case studies and anything you like from there, Jim. Okay, so let's start with the basics of what is shadow. So this was a term that was coined by the psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung in the 1940s. Basically, it's to describe any part of ourselves that we don't consciously recognize as us. So it is effectively any emotion or belief that is repressed often enough so it becomes unconscious. And then we start living in it as a reactive pattern rather than responding to an actual event or stimuli in real time. So shadow work also overlaps with what we call inner child work, because the overwhelming majority of our shadow is born in our very early years. So where does the actual shadow come from? In some instances, it comes from chronic trauma and abuse. And this particular problems require a specialized and holistic approach to healing. So that's not what we're going to be talking about today. But for those of us who grew up in a relatively normal family, whatever that is, but even with the most loving and well-intentioned parents, we will still have repressed emotions. We will still have shadows because they're, parents are flawed humans doing the best they can. And our society has certain collective shadows. So does the education system, so does the working environment. So there's layers of things, not just the immediate child's upbringing, because all those layers affect the people who raise us, as well as what we then grow up to repeat those patterns in. So all shadow at the very, very root is grounded in unmet needs for safety and security. So think about what safety and security means to a 3-year-old. So not through the intellect of an adult, but through a 3-year-old or 4-year-old. Imagine a 3-year-old running into their parents' bedroom, crying because there's a huge thunderstorm. And for them, their whole world is shaking. They don't know what's going on. They're seeking comfort. They're seeking reassurance of their safety in the world. Now, if the parent is present, they can soothe the child, they can hug them. But most parents, being, half awake, being in the intellect of an adult, they might start going, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of. It's just the storm. Go back to bed. It'll be over soon. So often adults, in, again, the best intentions, can, in the way that they respond to a young child's need for the safety and security, start a pattern where this child is reaching out because they're feeling unsafe. But the adult, their response is making the child feel wrong for not feeling safe. It's making the child feel wrong for reaching out for that affirmation. So how the shadow expresses itself as we grow up can be fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, unworthiness, being hypercritical of ourselves and others, perfectionism, powerlessness, etc. And how this might look in our adult lives saying yes when we really, really want to say no, overcommitting to the point of being overwhelmed and burning out, not having healthy boundaries, twisting ourselves into pretzels, trying to please other people, people pleasers, having to make someone else wrong before we can stand in our own truth and say no, or feeling strongly about something but agreeing with another view just to keep the peace. So these are some of the ways that it might look like in an adult's life. But let's touch on 3 points I want to raise about the shadow. The shadow and how we align it with the ego are not wrong. They're not bad. They were actually born of us at a time when we didn't have another healthier mechanism for dealing with whatever was happening for us. So if you can imagine that 3-year-old part of you that in their survival, desire for survival, created a story to be able to rationalize as much as a 3-year-old can about why things were happening a certain way, and therefore how they should respond in order to stay safe. So if we can recognize that from a 3-year-old's point of view, then we can really honor it as a survival mechanism. Because unfortunately, what happens with a lot of personal and spiritual development, such as shadow work, is people come with it with the logic of an adult. And then the first thing they put on everything is shame and guilt, that I shouldn't do this. I should be better than this. I can't believe I behave like this, etc. So that is an adult logic judging that 3-year-old. So there's no healing possible in that space. So the first thing we need to accept is the shadow is not wrong. The shadow is there as a survival mechanism at a time when we didn't have another option. But living unconsciously with these childhood patterns and being blind to the triggers we have from them that can create situations in our adult lives, in the societies we live in, which are then damaging and perpetuating very much things we don't want. That's what we need to recognize. We need to acknowledge our part, bring consciousness to that unconscious part. And so we can then start actively choosing different if we want to. But here's the thing. You don't owe your healing to anyone. And you certainly don't owe your healing to anyone on anyone's timeline. So one of the reasons some people shy away from doing shadow work or acknowledging when they sense, some greater awakening in their own consciousness about their behavior coming through, is they sense that at some level, they're not quite ready to let go of this coping mechanism or pattern. So they'll just say, no, I don't, I don't see anything. I don't want to know anything, because they think that as soon as something comes to their awareness, they must deal with it in that moment. Okay, so let yourself off the hook while staying responsible for yourself. That it's okay to recognize something and be honest enough with yourself to say, I'm not ready to heal this yet. But then you keep yourself accountable to being on a path of healing and increasing self-awareness so you can get to the point of healing that when you're ready. Because here's the thing, if we refuse to recognize something of the pattern we're creating now, and in 2 years' time, we are still spinning the same stories and it's locked in the same pattern, thinking, well, this is my life, this is just who I am, I have no options, you're kind of stuck. Whereas if you come to some awareness now, even if you decide that you're not ready to actively release it yet, then it will always be in the back of your mind, looking for an opportunity to heal just a little bit more, to heal just a little bit more. And then say in 2 years' time, you get to that point of frustration and deciding that the comfort of being unhappy is no longer worth it. Then at least in the back of your mind, you know that there's an alternative option for you and that you can step into a deeper level of self-love and self-trust to do the work required for it. And I said there was 3, but I'm going to make a 4th point because this is important. Shadow work is not easy, but it is so worth it. because when we're living in reaction, we are never fully capable of creating whatever we desire: freedom, new earth, conscious businesses, because we are always responding to old stories and old stimuli. It's only when we increase the awareness of why we choose or behave in certain patterns that we can, in that space of cause and effect, bring in greater conscious choice. And when we make conscious choice, that is where the space of creation is. That is where we stop trying to rehash old things and we feel into what is possible now. So there are some things to keep in mind around the relationship of the shadow to ourselves and how the childhood lives into the adulthood. So now let's just briefly touch on the relationship between individuals, business, and politics in terms of the shadow. So the more repressed our emotions, the more segmented we are. I'm angry, I'm happy. So it's like Smurfs. You're only allowed one emotion at a time, and then you're like constantly reacting out of that. But the more segmented we are, the less attached to our divine humanity, the less attached to that spark of life that connects us to wanting to create something beautiful in the world. And this makes it far too easy to walk into the office, leave our soul at the door, and make choices or enforce rules that we would never wish on our own family, all under the I'm just following orders, or that's just how business is done. I'm sure we've all heard of that, especially in the last 2 years. So what is politics but business with international and reach? So everything stems from the individual. The individual is the one that runs businesses, and the individual is the one that goes into politics. So I personally don't believe that we can heal all the corruption and the lack of transparency in how certain businesses and our government behaves if we're not also concentrating on healing the individual shadow within ourselves. So look, the journey of integration never ends, right? But the more we live from the center of our whole being, the more conscious choices we make, the more responsible we are for our choices, the more we are willing to make the ethical but unpopular decisions, because our sense of self-worth and validation isn't tied into belonging to a mob at any cost. And we trust our own resilience to find a way through the unknown, or to tolerate something that's uncomfortable just because it's not, the thing that's done in our group at the time. So to truly create the freedom that we crave, and to create the new earth, or whatever your vision or title for it is, based on integrity and authenticity, I believe we have to act on two fronts, and both of them are equally important. And I touched on this a moment ago. One is to be in action, whatever that looks like in your life, to speak your truth and stand up for your freedoms, because living in the physical world calls on us to have the human experience. And secondly, is to become self-aware and to live as consciously as possible, which means dissolving the coping mechanisms, triggers, and blocks, and ultimately integrating those gifts and blessings and learnings and challenges into our whole self. So on that front, Jim touched on the opportunities and the chaos of what's happening. The blessing of COVID, if you want to call it that, is that over the last 2 years, our regular life patterns have been really disrupted. So, pre-2020, people were busy to a certain level. They were constantly in action about certain things. So it was very easy to become oblivious of the patterns we were constantly living out in response to our triggers and shadow. But what happened in 2020, when most of the world went into lockdown, Australia certainly did, was we no longer had those same patterns that we had become so ingrained with. And yet the problems continued. What I was finding, the conversations with my clients, they're coming to me in 2020 saying, well, this is happening and this is happening, and I just noticed this. And in their mind, they're only recognizing it in the first few months or, the year of 2020. But our conversation leads them to recognize that they've actually been doing this for years. It's just because the patterns that they've buried their own patterns in have suddenly shifted, that their patterns are now really sticking out, obviously, which is an opportune time for healing, because you kind of stop being able to lie to yourself as easily. So that is the blessing of this chaos, is go, how am I contributing to the very things that I'm not happy with? So in any kind of energy and personal development work, one of the biggest obstacles I find is hypocrisy. When I think about hypocrisy and the energy of hypocrisy, it's literally like an energy leak. And it very much supports the very thing that you say you stand against. Because imagine you are a freedom advocate and you are critical of a certain group of people for being unethical, acting out of integrity, not doing what they say they're going to do, etc. But then you look at your home life and you're repeating those exact same patterns with how you parent, with how you run your house, with how you show up for work. So when we're sitting in certain patterns, but all we're doing is pointing the finger there, as they say, one finger points up, four fingers points back. How can I expect that side, whoever that is, to do anything I'm not willing to do? So this is some of where as the inner, so the outer works as well, because the stronger I stand in integrity, the stronger my essence, my understanding, my willingness to create that into the world. Whereas that if I'm only demanding things from there, other people, the government, that I'm not willing to do for me, then I am playing out the very same pattern that my government has done on a bigger scale. And I'm not taking responsibility for that either. So this is where the hypocrisy comes in. So this is why I believe working on the 3D human physical, which is the action, as well as the 5D spiritual and emotional, which is the self-awareness, comes in very much parallel but together, because both support and strengthen each other. And the other thing I'll touch on is the question I get asked a lot. And again, it can look very different for individuals. So this is part of allowing yourself to figure out, how does this journey look for you? Is what is the difference between a reaction to a trigger or something that comes from our shadow compared to a response? Okay, so let's just say that a client who should know your worth, as I've been told people when they have the situation, they should know your worth, but they ask you for a discount. So what's the fact? A person asks you a question. That's the fact of what it is. Now, does that person have a right to ask you a question? Sure. Do you have a right to give them whatever is your truthful answer? Sure. So client says, can I have a discount? And you consider it. Do I want to give them a discount? Yes, because And if that comes from free will and without any kind of mind chatter about, I have to because, if you're giving it as an honest yes, excellent. Or if you want to say no, because and that's fine too. So that is a response to the moment. That is responding to the current situation and stimuli. Whereas a reaction is, how dare they ask me? Don't they know how hard I work? The hours I spent, what do they think I am? They're just trying to rob me blind. So that is a story. And we weave stories when we are reacting to something. A couple of years ago, somebody questioned our worth. And a couple of years before that, somebody said this. And I have, because of whatever happened in my childhood, an ingrained story that I'm not good enough. So when I'm coming from a place of not good enough and somebody dares ask a question that, touches that wound of mine, then where I'm coming from is years of baggage. It's not me responding to the question in the moment. So that's one of the ways that we can recognize, are we acting out of a shadow or are we responding to a stimuli? And the other things that will often be a signpost to look out for, if you like, are coping mechanisms. So our coping mechanisms, usually any of the isms like alcoholism, workaholism, shopaholicism, these are patterns we have created to suppress whatever uncomfortable emotion or belief we are not wanting to deal with. So, people will often binge eat, binge watch, binge social media, whatever, as a way to numb out, because whatever is happening is bringing up emotions and thoughts that they're not comfortable to deal with. So better over there. But here's the thing, it never goes away. We can push it out the door as many times as we want. And in fact, every time we kind of catch a glimpse of it, but we shove it out the door, it becomes even stronger, because it's not like you don't know, you do know, but you're just fooling yourself that you don't know. So these are some of the signposts and things to consider around recognizing your shadow, and then starting to have that conversation with yourself about what's going on for me. So I do have some pointers about how to do shadow work if that's of interest, or I'm happy to take questions or explore case studies or anything you like, Jim.
Thank you. That was great. Let's see, what are the pointers kind of? What
As far as how to do it?
Yeah, because I was going to ask what you suggest, or if there are tools you use like EFT or tapping or different things to help clear stuff out, or people can do some of this at home on their own. Yeah. What?
Absolutely. Yep. Okay. Great question. So EFT is fabulous. But what you need to bring in before you do any of the healing is the actual awareness. Okay. So I'll talk you through a couple of steps of things to think about how you approach it. So the biggest part of starting to become conscious of your shadow is to increase the self-awareness, is to start noticing the triggers and blocks and patterns. Okay. So as I mentioned before, look at when your coping mechanisms kick in. So if you tend to binge on any behavior, what does it usually in response to? What is it that sends you down that path? Or, even if you look at the global situation now, what is the thing that's most triggering to you? What's most upsetting to you? And then if you thought, well, if I took that issue, where does it play out in my life? And use that as an insight to go, okay, where is that upsetting for me? Where's the patterns for that coming from me? Okay. So, and then again, when you bring in this self-awareness, and then you can go, did I just have a reaction to something? Or was that a balanced response? Okay. So if we take it to the conversation around a client asking you for a discount, if you're having a balanced response, that's fine. There's no shadow in there. But if you're having the reaction about how could they question my worth, then you can follow. So what happens is when you notice, and I mean, the body is a fabulous mechanism for this, right? So when we are balanced, and so for me, when I talk about the shadow, I talk about being in the light, which is when you're choosing your behavior consciously, or in the shadow, which is where you're reacting unconsciously. And the body is a fabulous mechanism. So when we are feeling balanced and relaxed, the shoulders are open, the jaw is unclenched, the belly sits comfortably. But when we are in a reactive state, everything clenches up. So one of the ways you can, assess for yourself, are you having a triggered moment? Is the shadow trying to express itself? Is feel into your body. When I think of that situation that happened 2 weeks ago, because, people, we ruminate, oh, that thing and that story, and we try and keep trying to justify it. So when something comes to your attention, one, visualize or feel the event and go, what's happening in my body? Because when something's not resolved and we hold that memory in our mind, the body will react like it's happening all over again. So when I think about that conversation with the client and I think about what I felt and said, if my body is staying relaxed, that's a pretty good sign that I was having a natural response and I'm okay with what was happening. But if I think about it and I'm still going back into that story and my body start clenching up, then I know there's a bigger backstory. And a backstory is always a really good place to start with shadow work. So I'm having a response. Now, sometimes it can take us a week to even recognize that, oh, that thing that happened last week when I was sort of going a little bit crazy, that was the trigger. That was something I'm repressing, right? But as you bring in the awareness, then the space between what happens and your ability to recognize whether you're reacting or responding will close in. So often it gets to the point where you open your mouth and you go, okay, I can sense there's a trigger there. I'm just going to breathe into it and then increase that space. And then in that space, you go, what's happening for me? Okay. So I mentioned before about our tendency as adults with logic to bring in shame and guilt when we're dealing with our shadow. But if we can suspend that, even if you can't go to the place of honoring it as a necessity of your childhood, at least suspend the shame and guilt and bring in compassionate curiosity. So in that space between something happening and something coming out of your mouth, or even after, but as we increase the space, then the conversation can come in before the response instead of a week later. What was happening for me? I wonder why I responded that way. I wonder why that felt so strongly for me. So if we can start having this conversation with ourselves from a compassionate point of view, not a judgment point of view, then what I strongly use with my clients is journaling. And, for people who really struggle with writing, then even speaking it into an audio recording. Because when we just think thoughts, they can stay very generic and unstructured. But by the time we get it succinct enough to speak it out or journal into it, then it means we have organized our thoughts enough to express. And it's that in organization that we will start recognizing our patterns. Okay. And then the more you can link a response to an event. I had that really strong reaction when the client asked me for a discount. Because again, when things are generic, they kind of float outside of your being. But when you link it into an event, you can fuse your body and the feelings within your body to actually anchor into yourself, to deal with something in real time, rather than a theory out there. I mean, we all know the idea of learning something in theory compared to actually putting it into play in our lives. So recognizing our patterns is the first step. Bringing that awareness closer and closer to the event, and then eventually separating the event and the response, because then when the awareness sits there, we have more choice. And then engaging in the conversation of, why am I choosing this? What am I feeling? What's the strong feeling here? And once you start journaling about that, that inner dialogue is really, really important, because you know what? Nobody else has to ever read it. You could be as honest and ugly with yourself about what's really going on, but that needs expression. So you look at, why was I responding a certain way? And then you go, what was the story I was telling myself about that? or about myself or the other person. So when this person is asking me for a discount, I'm making it mean that they don't think I'm valuable. And the fact that I resisted before saying no thanks, maybe that means I don't value myself. So we're looking into what's the story we're telling ourselves in that situation. And then you look at what is the story covering up? What's the raw fear about it? So if this person asking about a discount is bringing up my stories on unworthiness, is the raw fear could be that I'm not good enough, that if I can't prove myself, then I don't belong here, I'm not safe. Okay, so that's part of the process of how to start unraveling the shadow. And look, it is very much a spiral process. Have patience. Often we think, but I've already dealt with anger. Why is anger coming up again? But it's, if you imagine the spiral, you deal with anger at this spot, and because you've resolved, you've taken off that layer of the onion, then, and you've integrated other things as you've done other parts, when you come back to anger again, you're at a deeper level. You're at a point where you trust yourself to even go deeper than you could have embodied before. So have patience, have compassion for yourself. So those are the basics of, the process of how you can approach it.
Great. Dave, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really interesting presentation and very relevant. Let's see, I'm struggling a little bit on how to ask the question, but basically, the emphasis of what you've said is emphasizes the individual and our role in kind of becoming more conscious and responsive and so forth. At the same time, as I think about it, it seems to me that we live in a world where the culture, call it the educational system, the political system, is kind of trying, if not trying, but it's serving to kind of exacerbate the problems with shadows that in terms of like making us afraid, kind of indulging our tendency to see ourselves as victims, and and not do the types of things that you're talking about. And I guess what I'm wondering about is there anything that we can do, besides for what we do individually, to try to change that situation so that we have a culture which would be, which would foster people living and functioning in a more conscious way?
Brilliant question, Dave. Very brilliant question. Yes. I'm on exactly the same page with you as the comments about what the education system and what society's institutions has been driving. Look, me with my tinfoil hat on, none of this is by accident. It's very much people who know the psychology of this stuff planning it out really well. So here's a couple of things. I'm a very spiritual person. So one of the thing that I mentioned before, the two parallel acts. One is me doing my individual shadow work. So I'm not coming from a place of hypocrisy, which is an energy drain. And me also being in action as a freedom activist. I know far too many people in the spiritual world who are like, I'm just going to trust in love and light and take no action. So I'm like, do you not live in the world? Do you not exist in the very society that is taking away our freedoms and threatening our children? And then on the other hand, I know a lot of activists who are so blind to how they're doing exactly what they're accusing the governments of doing. And yes, we should resist all of this tyranny at every point. But if they're not taking responsible, then where do we expect others to do what we're not willing to do? So what can we do as a group of individuals who take responsibility for us, but recognize what is also going out there? For me personally, because I'm a mother and I'm living in Sydney, Australia, and watching what's going on in New Zealand, you know, we're like at the pointy end of some crazy stuff. One of the things that comes into play with what you spoke about, Dave, is the collective shadow. So just as we have individual shadows, there is a collective shadow. So the collective shadow is like, you know, if we come from that space of safety and security, people who blindly follow something, a nationalism, a religious thing, or any grouping in order to belong, even when they know it's wrong, right? I mean, I must admit, the most interesting thing in 2020 was watching the COVID narrative play out in the US, because unlike the US, it wasn't a political divide in Australia. But watching the COVID narrative, Democrats say this, all Republicans say this, right? And I had a lot of Democratic friends who disagreed with the narrative, but they would not speak out because they couldn't risk being ostracized by their group, okay? So as a collective, we often do that. We will stay as part of something that doesn't serve us, and we can see it's not aligned to our values because we don't want to be the other. But what is a collective but a group of people, right? So it's that ripple effect thing that every time when you're standing in your clear power and you're not reacting to someone, then the next person you have a conversation with, and the next conversation, and so on, and you start impacting other people. The one thing about the most powerful thing for me about the shadow clarity when it comes to separating a reaction from a response, I don't think anybody I've ever come across has changed their mind about something because they were called stupid, right? So when we're reactive, because how can you threaten my kids and how can you do this? When we're coming from that space, all the other person's going to do is defend themselves. You know, the fists go up and the ears shut down. There's no conversation, right? Whereas if I can stand in my power and recognize you as another human doing your best, even if I totally disagree with everything you say and do, then the conversation is going to have a very different space. And the door to, if you ever have an inkling that something I was saying may be something you want to explore, the door is going to be open. In the last 6 months, I've had so many people who were ready to throw me out in 2020 come back and go, well, you kind of said something. Can you explain what it means now? Because it's kind of like simmered down enough. But as far as like when we recognize what's happening in our schooling institutions and in certain groups that are pushing the agendas and basically brainwashing our kids and the next generation and the next generation. It's not that I don't think there is something we can do as a collective, but when we look at a collective as a blanket group rather than the individuals in it. So, you know, there's a wonderful graphic, you know, there's quite a few of them, but the idea that the more people stand on that side of the plank, then the one person who's driving the corruption suddenly goes, psh, right? Because if you think of, let's just look at it in terms of what's happening with the COVID situation. In Sydney, I live in one of the supposedly highest vaccinated, most conservative areas. I decided I can't be the only one who thinks like I do. So I've organized a stand in the park, which is every Sunday for at least an hour. I'm out there with my bright yellow shirt that says, I stand for freedom, so that anybody else who wants to come, we now get maybe 15 to 20 people every Sunday. Some come back so what I'm saying is, I thought I was standing against this immovable wall of one of the most conservative, highly vaccinated areas. But I'm connecting with one person at a time, right? And one of the things that we've kind of all realized is in the groups of people who would say, if you're not vaccinated, you should die and you shouldn't have access to this and you should, be shut out. It is such a small group of people. The people who want to drive these terrible agendas against our kids in the institutions, they are such a small group of people, okay? On this side, there's those of us who are actively, visibly taking a stand, speaking out, okay? So there's a small group of us. Let's not lie about it. There's a lot of people who go, oh yeah. But here's this greater mass in the middle. They're not the guys who wish us ill, but they're not quite in our camp yet. But you know what? In all reality, I consider them part of the freedom movement. The more we have conversations, the less we judge, the more we leave this path open for them to recognize that they actually do stand with us. Because if you're not wishing me death because I'm not vaccinated, then we have more in common than you think, right?
Right.
So I think every time we have that conversation and we allow people to step in with us and have a conversation without fearing judgment. And look, I'll put my hand up there. In 2020, I was one angry mess. I had so many fights on Facebook. But I started, I was also following some people. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pete Evans. He's an Australian chef. And in 2020, he has a very big TV personality as well. And he does a lot of holistic health stuff. And in 2020, he was speaking up against the narrative, and I would follow his Facebook feed and he would get vitriol and all of this stuff. And I would just read his response and I would go, what is within him that allows him to respond from this place of peace? He never belittled, he never bit back. And I'm like, I want whatever is happening. So for me, I'm like, oh, wow, I have been sitting in so much reaction. Where is my anger coming from? And even now, 2 years into this, I recognize that my anger kicks in when I'm feeling disempowered, when I'm not taking all the practical and spiritual and energetic actions that I know I can, because occasionally I'll have a complete meltdown. It's usually when I'm tired, because that's when we're most reactive. And then I'll kind of come back to my center and I go, wow, what was that about? And I recognize that I'm like holding you. If you don't fight my children's freedom, we're all going to die. I mean, sorry, seriously, but that's, as a mother, that's where my fear goes, right? So when I'm sitting in there, you better do something, otherwise my children are going to die. How can I be anything but angry and reactive? But who the hell's going to want to talk to me? So I think, when we recognize that when we're having that reaction, wow, what's happening for me? I'm in deep fear about my kids, right? So I'm like, what can I do? Firstly, to soothe myself, I need to get into some practical action. I need to do something about who do I have a conversation with? Who do I take a stand with? How do I connect better with my kids so if anything happens, I'm the first person they come to? So you mentioned the education thing. One of my kids is at primary public school. One of my kids is homeschooled. So we're kind of riding both situations. But I coach a lot of parents who are homeschooling. And their thing is, my kids don't listen to me. I'm like, that's not a homeschooling issue. That's a relationship issue. So while we are actively trying to dismantle this very poisoned education system and the agendas they're putting into there and everything. So Dave, yes, we do everything to bring that down. We dismantle that at every level. But at the same time, what can I do to strengthen my relationship with my kids so that when they're getting this stuff on this stuff, we can still have this conversation at the dinner table? So we keep the connection, because there's always going to be things vying for our kids' attention. There's always going to be influences that we don't. I mean, they've been there for decades. It's just so obvious and so ugly right now that we are seeing it so clearly. And again, the mixed blessing. There's a lot of stuff that's been going on for decades, but they are super, super clear, which is a great opportunity for us to dismantle and recreate something new. So I'm sorry, that's not quite an answer, but an answer, Dave.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Artemiss, I think that was a good point you brought up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because I'm still seeing Dave. I don't know why. With the kids, I mean, going back to our collective society, and as Dave's talking about, everything has been kind of stacked against us. I think a lot of us are finding out there are more lies that, it's unbelievable how many things were wrong or how many lies they're out there. But on our personal relationships and our children, is there anything there? Maybe this is a time, and you can touch on that, for us to think about, instead of being triggered or our kids don't listen, how can we create something new? Or what does this time call for with our families, our children, our spouses?
So great question, Jim, because yeah, relationships are so key. And look, one of the things about relationships is key is we're always going to be more open to hear something we disagree with from someone that we have a good relationship with, that there's some level of common trust already, right? So in terms of it, first, again, self-responsibility. If I'm expecting you to speak openly with me, and if I expect you to listen to me when I'm telling you that, this is not good or this is good, and you do, am I doing the same thing? Am I an open hearing for you? So I think integrity and authenticity when we, as parents, now also it's got to be age appropriate. I mean, my son is 11, my daughter's 14. They both know everything that's going on. We've taken them to protests with us. We have declared dinner COVID-free zone because all of us need a family break from that. But otherwise, we keep things age appropriate. There's certain things that we don't share with them because it's not their job to know that there's other stuff down the road. They need to live as much in that childhood space as possible. But what we also have to be open is, if I want to choose as a free person, how do I extend that to you? Because I've had friends who have forbidden their kids from wearing face masks. They're teenagers. And I'm like, okay, I understand the health reasons. I don't want my kids wearing masks either. But are you not doing the very thing that you're saying you don't want the government telling you what to do? Is they do it just because I said so.
Right.
So the conversations I've had with my daughter, because at some point when she was with me, she wouldn't wear a mask, but if she was out by herself or with her grandmother, she would, because she just doesn't, she doesn't like to attract attention. She doesn't like people judging her, right?
Yeah.
So I just kept the conversation alive with her. I'd say, look, this is the reason I don't wear a mask. The health reasons, the obvious political, virtue signaling thing, but I respect your right to make that decision. And sometimes, and the conversation, it was fluid. It like over 6 months, she went from wearing it to not wearing it to now when we go out together, I go, what's your choice today? And she feels increasingly empowered to make that choice, knowing that I'm not judging her right or wrong. I say to her, if you are, sometimes there's an avenue for conversation when it comes up. You say, okay, well, if you're worried about being judged, is there anything else that, what do you think is going to be the worst thing that's going to happen when you get judged? And with relationships, unfortunately, this pandemic is shattering relationships and marriages and families. And again, my advice is, unless it's those people are in that very small group of you deserve to die, because I don't know, there's many conversations you can have around that. If they're in this group, just hold as much grace as you can. And if it is somebody you sincerely love and want to continue a relationship with, find the common space. Find one common space where you can coexist, because not everything, it has to be about the politics or the COVID or everything else going on. There was more to our lives before, there's going to be more to our lives after. Like for me and my husband, everything that's going on is such a huge part of our lives. But when I'm with my parents, both my parents are triple jabbed, but they support our choices not to. But we seriously live in two realities. Nothing in our lives even resembles like we're only 20 minutes apart physically, but so when we get together with them and we play card games and we talk about the family overseas, and it's not because I'm gagging myself, right? It's because I've made a choice that my loving, supportive parents, there's more to our relationship. I think purely because they do support our freedom choices. So I know they respect us. But, our whole relationship isn't about that. I have friends who the one partner believes very strongly like we do, and the other one believes very strongly the other way. And I'm like, okay, what is the one thing? The well-being of the family. It's like connect over that. Use that as your common ground to hold as much grace in the relationship while you're then trying to dismantle or heal the rest of it.
Yeah. We are coming up to the 1 o'clock hour. So why don't you tell people how they can reach you, or if you have social media or email or whatever you know.
Yes, I'm on all the socials and I'm very vocal on all the socials. So Artemiss K or Artemiss Keyhani. Some of the socials have one name or the other. So I'm on LinkedIn as Artemiss Keyhani. I'm on Facebook, personal profile Artemiss Keyhani or business Artemiss K. I'm on Instagram as Artemiss K. My website is artemissk.com. And I'm actually just about to roll out in 2 weeks' time a shadow work and personal development group specifically for freedom advocates, because we are all dealing stuff with ourselves exactly at the same time that we're trying to do the work out there. Exactly what Dave was touching on is the stuff out there as well, and we're going to do the stuff in here. So this is bringing in my two passions, which is the personal development and the freedom advocacy. I'm like, perfect. This is what my playground, my freedom, my life. It's all going to be in one place. So I have a newsletter you're welcome to sign up for. Email is art@artemissk.com. Cindy, please follow me on all of the platforms. It'd be great. I'd love to connect to other freedom lovers, critical thinkers. And look, even in that sphere, we don't all agree, and that's perfectly okay. I don't want to live in an echo chamber, but I do have very firm self-loving boundaries that I also will not put up with aggressive and unkind behavior, because that's just not an energy. No, Cindy, I'm not on Gab. I tried it. I couldn't quite get my head around it, but I'm on everything else.
Well, thank you so much, Artemiss. That was a great presentation, and we look forward to following up with you.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks everybody who joined.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you, and it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off, and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt-to-wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in, as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.